Hello and welcome to today's European SharePoint and Office 365 Community Webinar. My name is Shane and I am delighted to be joined by Aqeel Haider, who will be talking to you about best practices for deploying SharePoint Online and SharePoint 2016. Remember to join the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @EuropeanSP and our hashtag is ESPC16. After the webinar, we will have a questions and answers session. Type any questions you have for Aqeel in the questions window. Some questions will be selected and answered at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and you will be notified by email when it is available. And now I'm going to pass you over to our webinar presenter, Aqeel Haider. Hello, Aqeel. Hello, Aqeel.
Thank you, Shane. Thank you, Shane. Thanks for that introduction. Great. And I'm hoping people can see my screen, and we'll kick this off. So, again, thank you very much for that introduction. I'll just briefly get into today's discussion. A quick introduction about myself, who I am. I'm actually based out of the Washington, D.C. area in the United States. I've been in the IT industry for about 16 plus years with SharePoint for a long, long time from its 2003 version, unfortunately or fortunately, however you want to look at it, and have worked at numerous various enterprises and organizations, primarily focused in the consulting world, and have had the privilege of deploying recently a SharePoint 2016 environment in a hybrid format for one of the largest government projects out here in Washington, D.C. And some of the things that we learned through that, some of the discussions and key points that came out of that are going to be the focus of our discussion today. My contact information will be shared at the end of the presentation again, and if anyone would like to get a hold of me for further discussions, happy to do that offline. So today's agenda, we are going to cover the discussion between as Office 365 has evolved into the full-blown platform for Microsoft's cloud solution for collaboration. And a lot of large enterprises in their legacy environments still have SharePoint deployed. There has been a dearth or shortage of understanding of hybrid SharePoint. And so working collaboratively to come up with what is hybrid SharePoint, what are some of the key considerations when deploying SharePoint in a hybrid model. We'll cover some common hybrid use cases and scenarios. And then we'll, at a very high level, talk about designing SharePoint and a SharePoint hybrid environment, and what are some of the key considerations thereof. What this session is not going to cover is detailed how to do things. Those things are very easy to figure out, in my opinion, from a technical perspective, using TechNet and other resources. However, if there are technical questions regarding on how some of these things that I talked about are done, I'll try to cover them as best as I can during today's discussion. But if I cannot get into the depth of a question, then I will be happy to take that offline via my blog or via my email contact information directly with you. So let's get into a very basic thing. I won't spend too much time, considering everybody over here has seen some format of SharePoint. Essentially, a SharePoint environment, a hybrid SharePoint environment, is one where there is an on-prem SharePoint environment, and that is integrated with a SharePoint Online Office 365 tenant with multiple workloads split between the two respective environments. And that in essence is a hybrid SharePoint environment. There is no such thing as a hybrid SharePoint server just for terminology's sake, or there is no such thing as hybrid SharePoint. The correct word to use is a hybrid SharePoint environment. And I just wanted to make sure we're using that terminology correctly as we go through our presentation today. So why consider deployment of SharePoint as a service in a hybrid scenario? This is very important. I want to talk about it from a business problem perspective. One of the key things that as organizations move to the cloud, the issue has been that with their on-prem environments, the lack of flexibility that exists. A lot of customizations have been, organizations have spent countless amount of man hours and dollars in customizing their on-prem environments, and they don't want to necessarily throw away those investments. The third business reason, which is very important, is in the global workforce environment with enterprise customers distributed across multiple continents, multiple locations. It makes very good sense to leverage a hybrid environment with a distributed Office 365 tenant environment. The biggest reason for me, which I have run into this, is regulatory reasons and governance. Organizations are open to moving some content that is housed in their collaboration environment or their SharePoint environment, whatever its use case may be on-prem, into moving it into the cloud, but they don't want to necessarily give up control of sensitive data. And in this case, again, it makes very good sense to consider SharePoint Online and SharePoint On-prem in the hybrid scenario. The last but least and most important case is manageability. In the old days, it used to take an arm and a leg for a system administrator of SharePoint as well as a system and service engineers and change management process, for example, to provision external users to access internal SharePoint environments through the firewall or what have you not. For certain scenarios, we'll discuss those as we go along in this presentation today, it makes perfect sense from a use case perspective to leverage SharePoint Online and integrate it to the back-end system so that both the internal users and the external users have a seamless understanding and have a seamless experience using SharePoint. One fact from Gartner that I recently got is that 58% of enterprises globally have some service deployed to the cloud, whether it is SharePoint, whether it's email, whether it's Exchange, what have you not, whatever service they do have, 58% of all enterprises globally now have some service deployed in the cloud. So in the next iteration, in the next generation of SharePoint, as I see it evolving, I do believe that we are going to see a huge presence of SharePoint where most of the SharePoint environments for enterprises are going to cohabit and coexist in both locations. So let's quickly talk about two scenarios of the hybrid model in an enterprise. What could potentially happen? Organizations could migrate to the cloud, have made a decision that they're going to retire their on-prem environment and migrate to the cloud. And leveraging a hybrid scenario, what it allows them to do is to migrate at their own pace without disruption to existing service. You can also mitigate any risk associated with, as I mentioned earlier, with content regulations and mitigate any firewall, network, all of those issues by doing a pilot and moving in that direction. In the other scenario, what takes place is certain organizations which will never move everything to the cloud. The United States government is one such example, one of the leading projects that I'm running right now for a client over there requires them to maintain certain data, of course, on-prem. And they will continue to maintain a hybrid model for Kingdom Come. And this has certain advantages. What it does is it allows them to continue to use the best of both worlds. They can continue to use their investments on the customizations and the way they've created their content structures and so forth on-prem, as well as split the workloads for the low-impact items into the cloud. And it's very easily can be scheduled. It can be a phased rollout, reducing and mitigating risk. So I've covered the two major parts of the webinar where I wanted to talk about what a SharePoint hybrid environment is and why it makes sense for us to talk about it and what are the key things involved. Now, from an architecture perspective, in my humble opinion, there are other items over here too, but the three major considerations to have during any type of design or consideration or preliminary design and early stage consideration of a SharePoint hybrid environment is to consider three factors. One is the information architecture, the second is security and identity management, and the third is the user search experience. There are, of course, tons of service applications that support all of this, but for the majority of, regardless of what you are using your SharePoint environment for, these three categories are the key items that need to be designed for in any given SharePoint environment as you move from on-prem to the cloud. And we'll get more detailed into each one of these considerations as we go along. So I'm not going to get into too much details about information architecture and what the hybrid scenario it is, but I don't want to get, my assumption is over here on this audience, everybody understands what information architecture means. And it's the classification and the structural organization of how your content, including your site structure, your pages, content, and everything else, is laid out from a hierarchical topographical perspective throughout your organization. How content is available to the people to be able to do their jobs. And that essentially is a very high level covering of all of these things. In the case of hybrid SharePoint, there are multiple things to consider. One is that your entire site hierarchy and navigation structure is going to completely and radically change. The key element to understand over here is whereas you could control all of this in your on-prem environment in the past, you are dependent on how SharePoint Online handles its navigation structure. So you have to leverage the managed metadata service to create the navigation structure and then have it perpetuate between the two environments. The key advantage of this is that your end users have a seamless environment when they go from one either on-prem to off-prem, or your off-prem users come to your on-prem environment if they have been given the correct security permissions. And when we get into the security section, we'll have a discussion on that. So the key element to take away from this is that the end user has to have a seamless experience. Whether you have an intranet integrated with an extranet, or you have team sites, or you have OneDrive for Business, or whether you have Yammer, whatever workload that you are leveraging in your environment, the key time that you have to spend in understanding how how to build and lay out your environment, the most important thing, in my opinion, is to dedicate enough hours and time to understand how your information is going to be structured. This directly ties into your governance rules as well as what content sits where, the content life cycle management, the entire retention policies and so forth associated with that. If there's a records management capability and requirement, all of those need to be sorted out and discussed and an information architecture created. I've thrown in some buzzwords. For example, one of the biggest use cases that I see is OneDrive for Business due to its popularity because it is so easy to use in SharePoint Online is a low-hanging fruit that a lot of my clients have in the past implemented first in this hybrid scenario and offloaded that workload into the cloud. Primary reason is they can offer it as a service which does not impact their primary intranets or team sites or so forth. It allows for scalability because of unlimited storage based on what type of Office 365 plan you have and so forth. But for it to work, of course, there are a lot of dependencies, and I'll get into that briefly. Profiles, user profiles is another big one. They do exist in both locations, but the SharePoint server on-prem links the user profiles and redirects every person to the synchronized user profiles in Office 365. But as I mentioned, I'm not going to go into the how that happens, but if it's set up properly, that's one of the key considerations to remember that you have to do ahead of time. That means every user that you have on-prem will have a user profile off-prem. As I mentioned, redirecting OneDrive to the cloud. One-off example that I wanted to give out here. Basically, it allows on-prem users to leverage the on-cloud version and the on-cloud version people to also use that OneDrive scenario. The rest of everybody's My Sites continues to exist in on-prem. This is a classic example of a workload that is split between the two environments. If in my example, team sites were staying on-prem, the users would click on their OneDrive in the right upper hand menu and would be redirected to the cloud. If as the information architecture was designed properly, leveraging the same consistent user interface and look and feel, it was a seamless transition for the end users. Just the last point over there, that you can control the rollout of such workloads and splits using audiences and groups in SharePoint. So that covers at a very high level one of the key aspects around designing a SharePoint hybrid environment. The next thing that I'm going to cover is extremely important as enterprises move to the cloud. I don't believe any SharePoint architect or any senior SharePoint person has ever been engaged in a project where a security group or risk management group has not been involved in a project when an organization is moving from on-prem to off-prem in the cloud. And this is the biggest hurdle to overcome in most migrations or most deployments of SharePoint hybrid environments. There are three potential possibilities available leveraging the Microsoft stack of native technologies. You can, of course, go outside the Microsoft stack and implement a single sign-on solution with third-party providers that can solve this problem for you. But remaining within the boundary conditions defined of Microsoft, the three potential solutions that are available for us is either your identity is solely maintained in the cloud. That means you do not have an on-prem Active Directory. This obviously is not relevant in our case because we are talking about hybrid today, so there is an on-prem environment and an AD environment. The second case is of a directory and password synchronization, which is using AD Connect and Password Sync, where an on-premise identity is synchronized to the cloud. And the third is full federation for single sign-on, and where it's basically leveraging a single federated identity and credentials across the board, and suitable for medium to large organizations. I'll talk specifically about the two directory sync, and I'm going to not so much focus on cloud identity, and I'm going to talk more about what directory synchronization is first, and then I'll cover the ADFS piece and how and why it is important, what are some of the pros and cons in the context of deploying SharePoint as a service in a hybrid environment. First, what is directory synchronization? Well, directory synchronization is the integration of your on-prem Active Directory with some instance of an Active Directory running in the Azure cloud supporting Office 365. The synchronization essentially, basically all it does is makes a copy of your on-prem directory objects and then propagates them to the Active Directory instance in the cloud. And then the synchronization runs on a scheduled basis to push the changes from on-prem directory to the cloud instance. So there are some, and I'll get into the advantages and disadvantages of this later on, but one of the biggest race conditions that can happen is that if you actually create, if you create a user in the cloud and you're not careful about it and you haven't put a process around it, that user doesn't propagate down to your own Active Directory. And this could create a cloud-only identity for that user, and they won't necessarily get access to your SharePoint on-prem environment because the authentication will fail. So that's basically it. There are multiple processes and multiple different methodologies on how this is done. The authorization takes place in the cloud when users log into your Office 365 portal. ADFS. Well, ADFS is Active Directory Federation Services. That's what it stands for. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but my assumption here is that everybody understands what it basically does. But it's basically, it provides federation and single sign-on capabilities for all Office 365 applications that need to be supported between on-prem AD and the cloud. Basically, an identity provider authenticates the user to provide security tokens to applications that trust ADFS, and then the federation provider consumes those tokens from other identity providers and then provides the tokens to applications that trust the ADFS. So essentially, it's a two-way trust between on-prem and the cloud at a very high level between Azure AD and so forth. Regarding why did I spend a little bit of time explaining these two approaches, is it has a direct impact on how you design and implement your security structure when it comes to SharePoint Online and SharePoint 2016 on-prem. And I'll get into that right now. Some of the things regarding, as I said, DirSync and the old words and the AAD Connect in today's world is that it's a single server, it's a simple deployment, doesn't require a whole lot of things. If your DirSync server on-prem goes down, users are still able to get to Office 365 through authenticating into the cloud and Windows Azure AD. The disadvantages is that you'll either have to implement some other third-party single sign-on solution. Single identity exists, but separate credentials can also take place. User account is authenticated by the Office 365 cloud environment. So if there is a business requirement from your security group or your security definition, this solution does not work for you. And it certainly is not fully redundant. It's a one-way thing, so there's no load balancing available in this particular case. When you are setting up ADFS, and this is where 90% of the use cases when I interact with organizations, they pretty much always go for ADFS or some other federation between Azure and or a third-party provider if there is one. But 90% of organizations where I've done my hybrid setups, they always seem to leverage ADFS, and the advantages speak for themselves. So authentication is made on-prem. That's the huge, biggest one for where different organizations can control the authentication parameters on that. It's fully fault tolerant and load balanced. You can create multiple ADFS servers and so forth. You can have single sign-on with on-prem and other apps as well. So once ADFS is set up, not only will it support your SharePoint hybrid environment, but it will support other apps that might be, if you have a SharePoint hosted app or you have a third-party hosted app within SharePoint, all of those can be leveraged using single sign-on. The other big one is that external from your organizations, without requiring a VPN, people can reset their passwords. All of these things are very important. In today's world, many security organizations require multi-factor authentication if you're not VPN'd into your SharePoint environment, and that is also supported. ADFS is actually needed for hybrid search to work properly, and if that is something that you're going to implement within your hybrid environment, you actually are bound and constrained to do so over here. I won't spend, again, too much time on the disadvantages. I've documented them, and as I said, this session is being recorded. You can easily access that information. So basically, it does require expertise. It does require hardware as well as people resources to implement. If ADFS services are down, users won't be able to get into any environment. You do need a public certificate from and publish that. And then it also, of course, adds an additional layer of complexity and potentially a layer of failure within your overall environment. So moving on, we will quickly just, I've covered the second item, which is the security and identity management piece. I'll quickly cover search in the next 10 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll open up for questions towards the end of our webinar. There are two potential options regarding search. One of the reasons I put search separately out from information architecture is that SharePoint search is so powerful now, and it can be leveraged not only to search SharePoint content, but in on-prem environments, has been in the past leveraged to search file shares, etc., and so forth, or other hosted apps locally as well. And I'll cover both those scenarios briefly over here. There are two potential options when you're considering setting up search. One is called cloud hybrid search. And as the diagram indicates, it's very simple. Your SharePoint on-prem environment and Office 365 environment share a single search index. You do not have to worry about setting up additional hardware on-prem. You do not have to worry about maintaining and sustaining indexes of content and updating those servers with all the service packs and so forth for all your on-prem environment. All of that is taken care of for you, and the index is actually hosted in Office 365. It's a great leap forward from the previous iterations of SharePoint. This was with the new SharePoint Online as well as SharePoint Server, the big plus, because the user experience is absolutely fabulous and beautiful. They get one single search center result set. All the results from both on-prem and Office 365 are ranked and presented to the users in that one single interface. And that's the key piece of the hybrid search which has come out with Office 365, SharePoint Online, and SharePoint Server 2016. The second option is the hybrid federated search. This is the old structured way of doing it before SharePoint 2016, where content from each environment is indexed locally but is made available to each environment through federation. And the look and feel of it isn't that great. You have two separate sets of results, if I was to explain that correctly. You'll have SharePoint Online content in one section for the same term set that you might be searching for, and you might have a completely different search set result for the secondary search in your on-prem environment. Well, the question would be asked then, and there are implications on how the entire search service is set up, what is the service, how the on-prem service application talks to the cloud application in either of the two cases, what are the new services and so forth. Again, that discussion is out of scope for this discussion, but be happy to answer those questions in much more detail offline. The key thing to remember, the key takeaway from this is that that users get unified search results. Search, relevance, ranking, and refiners are in a single place when you're using the cloud hybrid search. They get automatically the newest SharePoint Online search experience. You don't have to maintain your search servers. You don't have to worry about any of that stuff. If content is in the search index in the cloud, then all the cloud features which are not available with SharePoint Online on-prem are also by default available. So Delve works. Other things, if you had content publishing through search by query web parts, things like that would work, which would not work in your hybrid federated search environment. And the size of your search index becomes irrelevant. To me, this is the biggest gain. People used to spend thousands of dollars on disk storage and so forth for their search index. They had to optimize it. People used to make careers out of search engine optimization, and they will have a different career now. Not to say that it wouldn't be important. They would have to get cloud hybrid search to work properly. But they are abstracted from worrying about how the environment handles the search index. That is a huge positive in the cloud hybrid search. The hybrid federated search, the only biggest advantage for it to still exist is the governance and regulatory concerns that I had brought up earlier. Whereas a lot of people end up designing their environment where they set up the site information architecture and site hierarchy and leverage managed metadata service to publish their navigation structure and do a fabulous job with that, and the sites exist in the right areas on-prem or online. What they sometimes forget is, and then they implement cloud hybrid search, and then they're out of compliance with their regulatory requirements for data on-prem, because off-prem cloud has actually indexed their on-prem content. And I've seen that happen, and we just did an audit for a very big tax agency here in Washington, D.C. that we all pay our taxes for. Didn't realize that that was happening. So it's for those particular use cases or use case scenarios that hybrid federated search exists. That's one of the primary reasons why Microsoft is still supporting a multi-index environment. The bad part is that it's clunky for end users. You might search for a term set like author or my name in one environment, and you get a different search set result, and you get a completely different search set result when you do it online. And for certain organizations in certain places, that's perfectly fine. Other organizations, when they're not regulated and can have their content indexed in the cloud, if that is not your defining criteria, that certainly would be the right approach to consider cloud hybrid search. So we've covered a lot of material today. I rushed through some of it. I apologize. I thought I had more to cover. But I will pause here and bring Shane back into the conversation regarding any questions that have so far come up, Shane.
Thank you, Aqeel, for a great presentation. Yeah, we have some questions here, and if anybody wants to submit questions, now is the time. Okay, so first question, Aqeel. What happens to my customized SharePoint Online UI when Microsoft updates Office 365, and will it break my site?
That's a very, very good question. As I mentioned earlier, that if the SharePoint site is designed properly, in the old days we used to customize our master pages, we used to customize our page layouts and so forth, and then now we would have to do 2 different site deployments. That's not the way to do it anymore. The right way to do it is to manage the customized deployments using CSSs as best as you can. And so if you stick within those boundary conditions, whatever Microsoft changes or doesn't change, it should not impact your online, and it definitely won't impact your on-prem environment, but your online and on-prem should remain in sync. Now, having said that, there are minor modifications that you will still have to make through major patches that Microsoft deploys, and that's just the reality of any cloud-based solution.
Okay. Another question is, how do I migrate sites between environments?
That's again a very good question. There are multiple methodologies behind it. If you are moving sites from on-prem to online, there are third-party tools that we have leveraged. If depending on the size and the content, and if you are going to do any restructuring of that content, if you're going to reorganize and restructure the permission structure, the site layout, the content layout, it's best to consider a third-party tool like an AvePoint or a Metalogix. I don't work for them. There are tons of them out there. But it's potentially a huge time saver versus customizing things. If it's just moving a site flat from one location to the other, you can do that using the migration API that Microsoft has recently published, and you can leverage PowerShell to do that.
Great. What is the time frame for SharePoint Online to be upgraded to SharePoint 2016?
It has already, that's a very good question. Microsoft has said the admin portal is already actually showing SharePoint Online is on SharePoint 2016. Different pieces of it are actually cloud-first strategy. Microsoft has rolled out different components of SharePoint 2016 for different tenants, and they're doing it on a tenant-by-tenant basis. So it depends on where you are. If you are on if you're on the EPG client structure, or if you're on the government structure, you should have already seen a lot of those updates take place. If you're on a shared infrastructure, it might be further down the road. But everybody will be on SharePoint. SharePoint Online by the end of 2016 will definitely be all on SharePoint 2016.
That's brilliant. Aqeel, thank you so much for your time today and for putting this fantastic presentation together for us. Very much appreciated here at the European SharePoint Conference.
Thank you again, Shane, and I'll give everybody, if there's no more questions, I'll give everybody roughly 18 minutes back of their time.
Great. Thanks, Aqeel. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, everybody. So for more top quality training from the world's best speakers, look no further than Vienna for the European SharePoint Conference 2016. Book now because early bird prices end in 13 days. That's it for now. Join us again for our next webinar on Thursday, June 23rd from 3 to 4 p.m. CEST. Thank you.